In today's video, I'm going to run through the 10 commons and uncommons in Brothers War Draft that I will never put in my deck. There are plenty of other bad filler cards in the set that will unfortunately have to make my deck at some point, but I will be avoiding these 10 at all costs. Let's get to it. First up, Union of the Third Path. For 2 and a white, instant, draw a card, then you gain life equal to the number of cards in your hand. There's no life gain payoff in this set, so essentially you're paying 3 mana to cycle and gain 3 to 4 life. And the payoffs for drawing extra cards are in blue and black, so this card doesn't really do much of anything. Up next, Calamity's Wake. 1 and a white for an instant, exile all graveyards. Players can't cast non-creature spells this turn. Exile Calamity's Wake. This may have some utility in Constructed and might actually be playable if your opponent is heavily invested in interacting with their graveyard. For example, if they have tons of Unearth or they are specifically black-green. But an overwhelming amount of matchups, you will not even want this card out of the sideboard. And since most drafts for me personally are best of 1, I will never be playing Calamity's Wake. Up next, Defabricate. 1 and a blue, instant, choose 1, counter target artifact or enchantment spell. If a spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard, or counter target activated or triggered ability. This one isn't obviously terrible. At first glance, it seems like it might actually do a lot, but the second mode, it can just be immediately written off. This is very unlikely to ever be worth a card in Limited. And although you can hit the big, 8, 9, 10 mana artifacts with this card, we don't want this to just sit in our hand all game and hope our opponent casts something we can counter. Now compare this to Scatterray, the common counter spell that can hit the permanent type that really matters, creatures. I would rather just play that. I will not be playing Defabricate. Up next, Keeper of the Cadence. 4 and a blue for a creature human wizard. It's a 2/5. Pay 3, put target artifact, instant, or sorcery card from a graveyard on the bottom of its owner's library. Okay, so this just doesn't really have a home. This effect can hit your opponent's unearthed creature some of the time, and maybe you could loop your cool stuff when you're about to deck yourself, but 5 mana for a 2/5 is just unacceptable, and 3 mana for this effect is way too steep. Controlling the board is how you win games in Limited, and spending your turn 5 to play this card is just going to set you too far behind. Hard pass on Keeper of the Cadence. Up next, Splitting the Power Stone. 2 and a blue for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact. Create 2 tap Power Stone tokens. If the sacrificed artifact was legendary, draw a card. Okay, so in Limited, you will never trigger the second line of text. All of the legendary artifacts are rare, and you won't want to sacrifice any of them anyway. So essentially, you're paying 3 mana to turn a Power Stone or another cheap artifact into 2 Power Stones. That's just not good enough. If you really need to ramp, there are much better ways to do that. Do not play this card. Up next is Fog of War. Now this is probably a card you're going to lose a game to at least once, but again, to win games of Limited, you have to affect the board. This is effectively pay 3 mana to do nothing. Maybe there's a world where you build around this and you have a bunch of 4 mana creatures, but sort of unlikely. If you're behind and you play this, even if you gain 10 life, you're down a card. Wasted a turn because you left mana up, and your opponent just gets to develop further and attack you again. And they might not even attack after you leave mana up to play this. Play literally anything over Fog of War. Up next, Goblin Firebomb. 1 mana artifact with flash. Pay 7 and tap it. Sacrifice Goblin Firebomb. Destroy target permanent. We've seen cards like this before, and they're just too expensive to be good. You are always trading down on mana. If you're forced to play this card, unfortunately something went very wrong during the draft. Prioritize the efficient removal so you never have to play this. Up next, Thran Power Stone. 2 mana artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each aura and equipment attached to it and has ward 2. Equip cost of 2. So this seems like it might enable a sub-theme, but Ward 2 just isn't enough protection to take this risk and make it worth it. There aren't a ton of other equipment in the set, and playing tons of auras are usually not where you want to be in Limited. Trying to play 2 bad cards together to maybe make them both good is not a winning strategy. Up next is Swiftgear Drake. It is a 5 mana artifact creature, Drake. It's a 2/4 with flying and haste. When Swiftgear Drake enters the battlefield, put up to 1 target card from a graveyard on the bottom of its owner's library. This is another one that's not absolutely abysmal. This at least impacts the board, and creatures are never completely wasted space, but at 5 mana, this just doesn't do enough. The 2/4 stat line is really strange for a hasty flyer. This is not good for aggressive decks as a curve topper, and if you're playing a slower, more controlling deck, this is not the thing you want to be doing on 5 mana as you're starting to stabilize the board against a more aggressive opponent. And finally, Demolition Field. It's a land, tap for colorless, pay 2, sacrifice Demolition Field, destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls. They get to search for a land and put it into the battlefield, and you may do the same. This hurts your mana pretty significantly. Playing a colorless land in Limited is pretty painful, and you will very rarely run into one of the 2 lands I would argue are actually worth blowing up. Argoth, Sanctum of Nature, and Blast Zone. It's just going to be a dead card most of the time. Don't bother putting Demolition Field in your deck.